Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask our guests here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been muted. As we prepare to begin, it's always appreciated. And, of course, our internet viewers are welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Genevieve Wood. Ms. Wood is our Senior Fellow in Communications. She is also a senior contributor to the Daily Signal, Heritage's multimedia news organization. She represents both Heritage and the Daily Signal at events around the country to promote conservative public policy solutions. She previously served us as Vice President of Marketing, as well as overseeing our Leadership for America program. And before joining Heritage, she worked for a variety of political, policy, and media organizations. Please join me in welcoming Genevieve Wood. Genevieve?
Thank you, John, very much. Well, I think the only thing missing from my bio that I think is really important for today is that I was an intern for Jack Kemp in 1988, his very last summer on Capitol Hill in his congressional office, and I see Dave Hoppy back there who was in that office as well. I want to give a special welcome to Jimmy Kemp, who is one of Jack's sons, who's joining us here today, and also Ed Fulmer, who's next to Dave Hoppy, who was the founder and president of the Heritage Foundation until just about 2 years ago. So is on our board, and also was an advisor to Jack Kemp in 1996 when he was running with Bob Dole for the Republican nomination. So I know many of you here also have personal stories with Jack Kemp, and I can tell you if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, I would greatly encourage you to get one on the outside. I think you'll be even more encouraged to do so after you hear from our authors today. Jack Kemp is somebody, he was the first person I was actually able to vote for president in 1988. Many people talk about Ronald Reagan, and I loved Ronald Reagan too, but I was never old enough to vote for him. But in 1988, when Jack Kemp ran for the Republican nomination, I got to vote for him in the primaries before he dropped out and moved on. But nonetheless, I think the reason that we're here today to talk about the book is not just because of his political ideas. There are a lot of folks who have good political ideas, and he certainly had those. I shared his passion for supply-side economics, for enterprise zones, an idea that was crafted here at the Heritage Foundation. But beyond just his political ideas, one of the main reasons that I know that Morton, Kondracke, and Fred Barnes wrote this book was because of his optimism. There was hardly anybody who could be more optimistic and contagious in his passion for ideas than Jack Kemp. I mean, does anybody know anyone who can get as excited about the gold standard as Jack Kemp often did at times? But is that optimistic, that passion for ideas, somebody who wants to really advocate them and take them to every sector of the country and help others understand how life could be better for them if they embrace these ideas? Who's doing that today on either side of the political aisle? We're missing that kind of optimistic advocate. And I think that is another reason that both Morton and Fred Barnes wrote this book. They also say that one of their main reasons for doing so is that, quote, simply that Jack Kemp led a fascinating and inspiring life. And as someone who's had the pleasures I had of reading it, I can tell you they do a great job of telling that story. So they're going to share that today, and let me introduce them. First is Morton Kondracke. Morton and Fred, as you all know, were the Beltway boys for a number of years on the Fox News Channel together. But in coming together to write this book, they both did a lot of work on it. And Morton, interesting, conducted what's called the Kemp Oral History Project. He was also held the Jack Kemp Chair in Political Economy at the John W. Klug Center at the Library of Congress. So Morton interviewed a lot of folks who both worked with Jack Kemp over the years in his congressional office, his campaigns, other political figures, and I think brought a lot of that into this book. Morton is also the former executive editor and columnist for Roll Call. He was a Washington bureau chief of Newsweek, a senior editor of the New Republic, among other duties. Fred Barnes, also one of the Beltway boys, is the co-founder and executive editor of the Weekly Standard. He got his early start in journalism as the national political reporter for the Baltimore Sun, and I believe Fred was introduced to Jack Kemp by none other than the late, great journalist Robert Novak, is really who introduced you to him. Fred is also the former senior editor and White House correspondent for the New Republic. He was a regular panelist, as was Morton, on the McLaughlin Group. Always enjoyed watching him there, and contributed greatly to this book as well. We're going to begin by having them talk about their experiences and why they thought it was important to share the story of Jack Kemp, the very first biography that's been written on him, and then we're going to open it up to questions that you all have here in the audience. audience. So Morton, let me hand it over to you.
Okay, so before before I connect Jack Kemp up with the Heritage Foundation, I want to talk about another foundation, which is the Kemp Foundation, the Jack Kemp Foundation. Jimmy Kemp is the president, and it was through the Jack Kemp Foundation that I did the oral history. I did it for them, as a matter of fact, and interviewed 100 football players and members of Congress and staff members and family members and friends and stuff like that. And that was the basis of the material that got is in the book. And then it was the Kemp Foundation actually that endowed the Kemp Chair in Political Economy at the Library of Congress, where I sat for 2 years, and then the library was generous enough to let me sit there for another year because all of his papers are there. So I, combed through them. So this is not an authorized biography because the Kemp Foundation was generous in just letting me use all the material. But in any event, you ought to know about it, and you ought to know that Jimmy is trying to perpetuate the legacy and the spirit of Jack Kemp through the Kemp Foundation. Okay, so now there's a lot of connection between the Heritage Foundation and Jack Kemp. Had Jack Kemp not become the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Bush 41, he would have been a resident fellow at the Heritage Foundation because Ed Fulner and Kemp were pals, and Ed understood that Kemp stood for a lot of what the Heritage Foundation was all about. He actually had an office here and was about to move into it when he got appointed HUD secretary. And as Genevieve noted, Ed was on the plane with Jack during the '96 campaign, and a lot of ideas of Jack's enterprise zones and tenant ownership of public housing were originated here by Stuart Butler at the Heritage Foundation. So why did we write this book? I will talk for a little bit and then let Fred go on about. I won't take up all the time. But we say that in the first sentence, why did we write this book? We wrote it for four reasons, two of which I will get to, and I'll let Fred do the other two. First, maybe I'll let you do the most influential. Why he was the most influential politician of the 20th century who was not president. I'll let you explain what that was all about, since you're more enthusiastic even than I am about that. The fascinating human being is, Genevieve has already explained about his optimism. I mean, here was a kid who decided at the age of 5 that he wanted to be a pro football star, and he was a good high school football player, but he wasn't good enough to get into UCLA or USC, so he went to Occidental College, a school that does not produce a lot of NFL stars. So he was a second team or third team, I can't remember which, little college All-American. So what future was there for him in pro football? But he got drafted 573rd and got signed up with the New York Giants or Detroit Lions first. He was cut by 5 NFL teams in 3 years. It looked like he had no future, but his family had this saying: a door never closes but what another one opens. And he was one of these people who believed that you could do anything that you set your mind to. And so he never gave up. And he never gave up on supply side economics, and he never gave up on trying to convince his colleagues about it, which Fred will talk to you about at some length. So he's a fascinating human being. But the big reason that we've written this book is that America is in trouble, as it was in the in the 1970s. I mean, people forget. Most of you weren't even born in the 1970s, but it was a horrible era. It was an era of high unemployment, very high inflation, gas lines, Soviet advances around the world. The morale, 30% of the American people right now think that the country is on the right track, right? 13% thought it was on the right track in 1979. So we think that Kemp's policies and his spirit are needed in today's political environment. The tax reform was a Kemp idea. Lowering rates, broadening the base, eliminating a lot of loopholes will make the economy a lot more efficient. But spiritually, if you like, Kemp said that when economic times are bad and incomes are flat, politics becomes the demagogue's art of pitting one group against another, black against white, unions against corporations, rich against poor, North against South, whatever. That's what we see happening now. That's what Donald Trump is doing. Donald Trump is blaming the plight of the white working class on Mexican immigrants and foreigners. Right? He's not coming up with solutions. I'm glad to see his tax reform plan, which Kemp would have liked. But basically, he's running a campaign of division. Right? Kemp did not believe in division. Kemp believed only in addition. He wanted the Republican Party to once again become the party of Abraham Lincoln in two senses, both a civil rights party, a pro-civil rights party, but also the party of the working American, where what Abraham Lincoln said is that the basic idea of America is that everyone should be able to rise to the level that his talent and his effort can carry him. And most people in America think that the Republican Party doesn't care about them. Kemp was somebody who exuded caring and compassion about everybody, and that's what the Republican Party needs right now. And we think that the book, if the candidates would read it and if they would absorb some of it, could win. Fred?
That was unusually brief. Let me start by telling you my favorite story in the book. I mean, the one thing about Jack Kemp's career, there are great stories in it, and a lot of them are about football, a lot of them are about being a politician. This isn't my favorite story in it, but when I first met Jack Kemp, it was in 1981. I was a fairly young reporter, and I had read about supply-side economics, didn't know much about it. I'd never met Kemp, and I was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, and I arranged to go on a day trip with Kemp back to Buffalo, and he had a plane to take him up there, and so I got on the plane with him, and I thought, boy, I'm going to get in a lot of questions. I'm going to really learn a lot. Kemp talked the whole time. I don't think I asked a single question. I tried, but I couldn't break in. Jack Kemp was always looking for converts, and I'll have to say I ultimately was, but that day I spent the whole day taking notes because he was talking the whole time. He gave a couple talks, and then we flew back, and I wrote a piece or two, and then later I've written many pieces about Jack Kemp over the years in different spots, for the Sun, for the New Republic magazine where I worked for a while, and anyway. My favorite story is this, it's the 1980 Republican Convention in Detroit. You remember Ronald Reagan was going to be anointed there as the Republican presidential candidate for 1980, and so it was a huge Reagan event. And Jack Kemp was hoping to be, as were his aides, hoping that he might be selected as Jack Kemp's running mate, as Ronald Reagan's running mate. And one thing that might have helped that was the speech that Jack Kemp was going to give at the convention. Kemp was a great speaker and an inspiring speaker. And he was to follow Barry Goldwater, who was speaking at this convention. This must have been the second or third night, maybe the second night of the convention. I'm not sure which one, but anyway, it doesn't matter. He was going to follow Barry Goldwater, and then there would be Kemp, and then there would be Henry Kissinger. And it would wind up when prime time ended at 11 o'clock that evening. Well, Barry Goldwater ran a little long. And so finally, the man in charge, supposedly the man in charge of what was going on the floor, on the stage anyway, was Mike Deaver, longtime aide of Ronald Reagan, who called down and said, scratch Kemp. We have to get Henry Kissinger on. We have to get him on in prime time. And fortunately for Jack Kemp and for America, as far as I'm concerned, the man on the stage who actually, the woman who did the introductions worked for him, his name was Tommy Evans. And he was a friend of Jack Kemp's. He was a congressman from Delaware. And when he got the order, tell Kemp to leave, we'll get him on, tomorrow night or something like that. And Kemp leaves. He accepts that. Gee, I'd like to have spoken tonight, but I couldn't. And he goes off on the floor of the convention in Detroit. And Tommy Evans decides, screw Deaver. I'm going to get Kemp on. And he tells some poor young woman there, announce Kemp, do it, announce Kemp. And so all of a sudden, while Henry Kissinger's expecting to go on, the announcers talking about, and one of Kemp's aides named Dave Smick, who's a friend of Morton and I both, and was very helpful on the book, the announcer saying, and he was a star quarterback for the San Diego Chargers. And all of a sudden, Dave Smick realized, wait a minute, they're announcing Kemp. He's going to go on. And they can't find him. He's out in the crowd somewhere, and Dave Smick and others were looking for him, and Dave Smick said, finally, he saw Kemp's head of hair above some people out in the audience, runs and gets him. He comes back up to the podium. They have his speech in the teleprompter. He reads about 2 sentences of it and then wings it from there with all the things he'd said many, many times. I remember seeing the speech. I was covering the convention. I'm sure you were too, Mort. And it was a dazzling speech. It was inspiring. Kemp was a dynamic speaker, which helped a lot, particularly for television purposes. It was the greatest speech he'd ever given. And they had, taking up more time, then they had a pro-Kemp for Veep demonstration on the floor, which went on for a while. It was a great event, but it hadn't have been for that great man, Tommy Evans, Republican congressman from Delaware, it wouldn't have happened. And of course, the rest of us there, who knew that was what was going on? And then Henry Kissinger had to come on after 11 o'clock that night. That was good too. So, anyway, we have this story in the book. In the Weekly Standard, we're doing an excerpt from the book. It's our cover story next week, and it's sort of about the Kemp era where he was really the dynamic and most important figure in Washington. From about the time he announced, he and Senator Roth of Delaware announced the Kemp-Roth tax cut, which was in the middle of, July of 1977, to the enactment of it, in Reagan's very close version of it in 1981, and that was really what at least I'm dubbing the Kemp era. And it really was. He was such an enormous figure. Let me mention 2 things. I don't know what the 2 Mort was expecting. I can't remember them. But the reasons we wrote the book.
The first sentence of the book.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. I remember that. It's the Jack Kemp was the most important and influential politician in America in the 20th century who was not president. I think I have that right. I see Ed Folder's reading it. I hope I'm close. Anyway, you get the drift. And he was. Certainly, as we add in a subordinate clause there, certainly the most important Republican. Just enormously important. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to write the book, because Jack Kemp was so important. There hadn't been a book written about him. And I found that young people in particular didn't know who he was, and they'd missed one of the most important people, obviously, and a guy who had this great life and was fun to be around. Remember Newt Gingrich saying that among all the other things he said about Kemp, he just said he made people happy. They liked hearing his speeches. Sometimes they'd have to hear it about 3 times, but it was a great speech. He was fun to be around, even if you couldn't get a word in edgewise. So okay. Kemp, wait a minute. Kemp, I've got 2 things to say. One, the tax cuts were so important because we had a quarter century of prosperity after that, like we hadn't seen in a long time. It was just amazing. Growth of over 6% and so on a number of years, and it really turned America around, and the spirits too, as Mort said. But another important thing was the intellectual achievement of Jack Kemp. You know, all the Keynesian economists, all the liberal economists, they threw up their hands. They didn't have a clue about what to do to end stagflation, which is simultaneous high inflation and high unemployment. They didn't have a clue. And actually, a number of them said so. Jack Kemp and the supply side economists had an answer. And it was cutting taxes, cutting income tax rates at every level from the top. You had to start at the top. One reason is, whether the supply siders like to say it or not, rich people tend to have a lot more money to invest. You know, it just works that way. And they do, particularly when you give an incentive to invest by lowering their income tax rate. Jack Kemp had that answer. None of these people who were the great economists who had been around Washington, supposedly great ones, and all the economic reporters. And remember Hobart Rowan of the Washington Post and all these guys, they hated this stuff. That can't be right. They couldn't believe it. And yet, these tax cuts, plus tax reform, which the Kemp was a leader of in 1986, just turned the country around. Lowered tax rates, and it took first actually George H.W. Bush, and then Clinton, and now Obama, who just loves tax increases and won't consider them, even though the economy has been stagnating for 7 years. Obama, who was not an intellectual giant, and Jack Kemp was an intellectual giant, and that was his great achievement. His second, but there's one other thing. And I still don't understand this. Maybe Morton can explain it to you. I just don't understand how Jack could hold together this supply-side movement. There were a lot of crazy people in it. These economists who didn't like each other, Jude Winniski at the Wall Street Journal, so influential, and Art Laffer, you know, with the famous curve, and Paul Craig Roberts, and Bruce Bartlett, and so all these, they didn't like each other. They'd show up at Kemp's house for dinner, and they'd all fight with each other. Sometimes they came close to actually slugging it out at some time. So you had that group. You had, very importantly, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. So you had some of that was in New York. You had Jack had been a great evangelist for supply-side economics and had attracted the smartest young House members in Congress. Newt Gingrich, Vin Weber, Dan Coates, Dan Lundgren, you could go down the list, Connie Mack, the smartest young members of Congress, most of whom wound up in the Senate, or at least a number of them did, or his House Speaker, Newt Gingrich. In fact, you know, Mort's interview of Newt Gingrich is still one of the most brilliant, great questions, great answers. That ought to be published somewhere. It was so good. Gingrich really understood Kemp, saw him as somebody who didn't care about the House that much. It was just his vehicle, but was really a presidential figure. He was interested in national solutions. He didn't care. And the good news was he wasn't on the House Ways and Means Committee, which would have dragged him down, actually. Kemp, and he didn't have to do the stuff that Ted Cruz does, screaming at the House Republican leaders and so on, and Senate Republican leaders. He just went around them. He had a movement. He went around them. How he held it together, and the third part of it was, I named the two legs, the third part of it was the most important one, Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, as I'm sure most of you know, was always a tax cutter, but this time he had to be convinced of a special type of tax cut. And it was, and Jack Kemp did. Kemp had an association. He was with Reagan much earlier. He'd been an intern in Reagan's gubernatorial office back when he played for the San Diego Chargers. And anyway, he and some of his aides forced their way into a meeting at LAX, the Los Angeles airport, in January of 1980, and converted Reagan to this particular type of tax cut. And it became a 25% across-the-board tax cut over 3 years, which we now know as Reaganomics. And why it was so important, and why conservatives and many, many other people look back at it as being so important is 2 words. It worked. It worked. Look at Obama's economic policy. It doesn't work. Big difference.
Well, that was short.
I had more to say.
Not. So I'll tell you my thought about why he managed to keep all these things together, and that was because he was in favor of something, in favor of big ideas. Right now, everybody in the country practically wants to shake up Washington. They're mad at Washington. They're furious at Washington, and they have every right to be furious at Washington because Washington gets nothing done. The Democrats and Republicans are so polarized they don't even talk to each other. So nothing gets done. So everybody wants to get rid of somebody. But Jack Kemp shook up the town, but he didn't shake up the town by pitting insiders against outsiders. He shook the town up with big ideas, and that's what the country needs, big ideas to advance the well-being of the American people. When you've got incomes, the average income of the average worker in America is flat to down over the past 25 years, we are open to the kind of stuff that you're getting out of Bernie Sanders, right? It's all it's the rich who are doing it to everybody else. What the Republicans need is a big idea sold with the kind of optimism and compassion, caring about people that Jack Kemp showed. So we'll open it up for questions, I guess.
We will, and we do have microphones. If you raise your hand, we'll have the microphone come to you. If you would just give us your name and if affiliation, if that's helpful, would be good to know where you're coming from, would be terrific. Who would like to, or a name, who would like to be our first question this morning? We'll start up here at the
good.
front. Great.
Hi, Dave Price, retired educator and journalist. Your book is about history, but you set your purpose, you're trying to get a message out to today. My question becomes whether you're a leftist or right. Ronald Reagan and Jack Kemp at that time were optimistic people. They did have plans. Is it the people in politics that have changed, or is it the times that have changed as you look back? Or is it just the American way, it was always better, But it seems like something's not the same. So is it the people, the times, obviously a combination of both, but your thoughts on that? Would there be another Ronald Reagan, Jack Kemp?
I quit writing columns because I got tired of listening to myself say, would you guys please get something done? I mean, and the quality that is missing is leadership. And now the question is, where are we going to find a leader? And, I can go down the list. I don't think Donald Trump is a constructive leader. I don't think Ted Cruz is a constructive leader. I think Jeb Bush could be a constructive leader, but Donald Trump is right. He lacks energy or hasn't quite figured out how to convey. I mean, he has a great record in Florida, but, the country doesn't know about it. He's got to figure out how to break through. And to answer part of your question, we live in a celebrity culture, and, the press is just crazy for Trump. Because if Beyonce ran for president, I'm convinced that she would be leading the Kanye West would be the front runner. So that's a problem. But what we need is we desperately need leadership. Now, whenever the United States has faced a moment of crisis in its history, we've always managed to come up with somebody who was the leader we needed, and we can only hope that it happens this time.
Come over to this side.
Hi, thank you all for speaking to us today. My name is Amanda, and I'm an intern here at Heritage. I just wanted to ask, as I'm sitting here and learning about Jack Kemp, he sounds like a wonderful man and influencer in his times. Why is he someone that millennials should look to as an example?
Well, read the book. It's because look, it's this. I'm 76. He's 42, and we're getting out of here one of these days. This is your world to inherit, right? And so the kind of leadership that the country needs is the kind of leadership that Ronald Reagan provided and Kemp inspired, right? And so history is important. And if you know the history, then you know what to look for in quality politicians, and you know what is not a quality politician. And I think you'll get a lot of this out of this book about leadership, about what real leadership is all about.
You know, one thing particularly young people ought to know is a trait not written about much that was shared by Reagan and Kemp. They read a lot. They read everything. They read all the great conservative writers over the years. I mean, Kemp would read von Mises, Ludwig von Mises, an Austrian economist. No doubt a great economist. Now, I've tried to read his main book called Human Action. I didn't make it. Kemp did. Remember, he was a phys ed major in college and wasn't much of a student then. He was interested in football and developed a great arm, a great passer. But he didn't study that much. But after he got out, he did, and he'd be toting around The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek and reading it in the locker room while his teammates were looking at Playboy. And he learned a lot. You know, he went to one of these summer programs of the Foundation for Economic Education up on the Hudson River, and Jack Kemp learned a lot. He was a voracious reader. Unbeknownst to most people, Ronald Reagan was an incredible reader too over the years. He had learned an incredible amount. You know, he had this very common man style that he liked that helped his great success. But Reagan knew a lot, and Jack Kemp knew a lot. And my advice is, I'm a great defender of newspapers. You don't have to read a newspaper. You can get a lot online in the news, but you can't replace books. There's just a lot you need to read. There's a lot of information there. You need to know a lot. It helps you in life. You don't have to wing it all the time.
Jimmy Kemp with the Kemp Foundation. So, as we all know, Paul Ryan worked for Dad and Empower America, and he's now chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Can you talk about, you talk about ideas, and certainly Ryan learned from Kemp. He was inspired by Kemp. But you're giving counsel to candidates kind of based on my dad's life. It is a different time. What do you think Paul should do? Clearly, he is someone who conservatives look to. He's not running for president. But how do you think he should best carry on that legacy from his perch, both in Ways and Means and in the party and in the movement?
Well, you know, the people complain that the Republican Congress hasn't done anything. I mean, I think Paul Ryan is in a great position to produce a tax reform plan now. You know, that the Congress could pass, the Republicans could unite around, and Obama could veto if he chose to. But at least it would say, this is what we stand for. Not only the presidential candidates doing it, the Republicans have been talking forever and ever about repealing and replacing Obamacare. Where's the bill? Where is the bill? I mean, they're gonna pass a bill that eliminates the mandates and stuff like that, and keeps the popular stuff. That doesn't add up. You can't cover 23 kids up to the age of 26 unless you have a way to pay for it. You eliminate the mandate. You don't collect the taxes. It's not going to add up. The Republicans have promised and promised and promised that they would replace it with a free market plan. Now, it's a multi-committee operation, but part of its Ways and Means, they ought to be doing that. That's my advice.
Well, the House of Representatives did repeal Obamacare. What have they done it now, about 17 or 18 times or
Not
something?
replaced it, though.
Well, they have. Well, why? It didn't get through the Senate. It hasn't been repealed
haven't
yet. It's only been the House that has done that. So
There ought to be one bill.
Well, look, they're
Repeal and
well,
replace.
Morton, I'll tell you. If you wait a minute, I'll tell you what's going to happen. There are 6 or 8 bills out there to replace Obamacare. They're all free market oriented. One of them is the Bill Kristol bill. My colleague at the Weekly Standard has a bill with a man named Jeff Anderson. It's a pretty good bill, but the person who's going to decide on what the Republican replacement is the presidential nominee. In particular, Mitch McConnell has said that explicitly. Look, we're not going to fool around with getting a Senate Republican replacement for Obamacare. There's no need for that now. It's going to be up to, with our advice, but it'll be up to the Republican presidential nominee, and that's when you'll get one. You'll have to put one out. So.
Okay,
That's the
I got it.
explanation. You'll get it then. But there's a lot to choose from. There are a lot of plans. Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan is in a great position to do just about everything that needs to be done economically. One, spur the economy with tax cuts. Two, as you said, tax reform. That's needed too. And three, entitlement reform. Paul Ryan says, he was a Kemp acolyte, worked for him at the Empower America, a think tank that doesn't exist anymore. He and Bill Bennett, Kemp and Bill Bennett, worked for him there, and is a full-blown Kemp supply-sider, no question about that. But the times have changed, as Jimmy mentioned, because now we have this huge deficit problem, this huge debt problem, and you have to take that into account. And the most important way you can do it now is entitlement reform.
So Kemp was constantly at war during the Reagan years with David Stockman, who was the budget director, and was constantly trying to raise taxes. And there's a letter that Trent Lott and Jack Kemp wrote to David Stockman at a certain point, and it said, David Stockman was trying to raise taxes on beer and cigarettes, working people's kind of stuff, and so they wrote this letter. How come you want to raise taxes on working people? How come you want to cut Medicaid, Head Start, and food stamps, but you don't want to cut subsidies for, in this case, it was Gulf Oil, Boeing, and Exxon? Now, that's a question that this Republican Congress and the presidential candidates ought to be addressing too. The Republicans constantly talk about crony capitalism in terms of Solyndra and the green energy companies that the Democrats give subsidies to. When the Republican Congress passed a farm bill last year, they cut back on food stamps, but they kept farm subsidies, they kept the ethanol requirement, right, which is a total corporate crony program. So if you want to appeal to working people, Donald Trump says, I'm gonna really hit the hedge fund operators. Baloney. His bill doesn't hit the hedge fund operators. You gotta eliminate carried interest for sure. You gotta go through the tax code and the subsidy list, and you gotta eliminate these what's called rents that these lobbyists have bought from Congress, Democrat and Republican, that give them special breaks, that give them advantages over other competitors because they outbid the other. And a Republican Party that really stood for working people and making the economy efficient would attack those, and so would Jack Kemp.
And I will just say, a plug here for Heritage, for those who are interested in crony capitalism and how to get rid of it, Heritage and Heritage Action have been doing a lot of work on that very topic over the last few years. You can read a lot about it on heritage.org. I would encourage you to check it out. Ed, did you have a question?
Thanks very much, Genevieve. This is fascinating. I've been around even longer than a couple of you guys, but my first boss was Mel Laird, who was chairman of the Republican Conference at the time, who used the Republican Conference very much the way Kemp did a decade later in terms of promoting ideas. You both talked about that just now in the kind of Paul Ryan context, looking, without casting any aspersions. Kathy McMorris Rogers is a very nice person, but I haven't seen many big ideas coming out of the Republican Conference. So is this by default, the way you were just talking about Ryan, is this Ryan's role now inside the Congress? Is there, how about the Senate side? Is there anybody there who's got big ideas, who's not in the presidential thing, who can pull people together?
Now those are two different things. Big ideas and pulling people together. Mike Lee of Utah has a lot of big ideas, Whether he can pull people together remains to be seen. You know, and that's about when you're thinking of Reagan and Jack Kemp, they were unique. I mean, they could bring people together remarkably and over an extended period of time. That's a great achievement. That's the hardest thing. You know, the lack of big ideas is a problem. I certainly agree with Mort, and you can't. It's not just the elected officials. It's groups like the Heritage Foundation. It's people on the outside. But Ed, you're right. Right now, there's only one person in Congress really that has really big ideas, has thought them through, can explain them and defend them, and that's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Paul Ryan.
No, this is not a big idea in the cosmic sense, but one of the great needs in this country, and I think the Republicans could get the credit for this, is medical research. The NIH budget, we are the headquarters of medical research in the world. The National Institutes of Health has been. Over the last 10 years, the net amount of money, the after inflation amount of money that we are spending as a federal government on medical research has fallen by a quarter. PhD candidates all over the country and look to their futures and find no future, and they have to go to Israel or they have to go to Ireland or somewhere else and some of them go to China in order to do medical research. Now, Fred Upton, who's the chairman of the
Energy and Commerce.
Energy and Commerce Committee, has got a bill called the 21st Century Cures Bill, which will modernize and increase the amount of funding for medical research. It will go to the Help Committee in the Senate, where Lamar Alexander has already worked with Patty Murray and developed a replacement for No Child Left Behind. That's progress. They are working on a higher education bill, which will make colleges accountable for the results they produce for getting federal aid. So there's stuff going on, but what they've got to do is they got to pass this stuff, and they've got to agree to pass it. You can't have a bunch of naysayers in the Congress who are willing to shut down the government, and they're the ones who attract all the attention. And firing the speaker when he demanding that he should do something that he can't possibly do, it's ridiculous. The Republicans have got to be known for getting stuff done that helps ordinary people, not just fighting among themselves.
There is a threat to medical research, and most medical research is done by the pharmaceutical companies. Billions and billions of dollars of it. It would be not eliminated, but squashed if people like Hillary Clinton, she came out with a plan that would curb medical research innovation and not quite stop it, but it would come close to that. And she's not alone among liberals and Democrats who think one of the big problems, it's not health in America. The big problem is that the pharmaceutical companies may be making too much money, and people who have stock in those companies may actually be getting wealthy. That's the problem, and it will, the kind of things they propose, the overregulation could drastically curb medical research, at least the private investment. I agree with Mort about NIH. It has a big role too.
We'll do one more question right here.
David Burton, the Heritage Foundation. First, I'd like to thank you two gentlemen for putting together this book. I think Jack Kemp's legacy deserves more attention than it's received. I have a question of you that I think reflects the political differences between the 70s and early 80s and now. And in those days, cutting taxes 30% across the board, cut taxes for the vast majority of the American people because most people paid some income tax. Today, 45% of the public pays no income tax, and the next 10% pay very, very little. So the tax-cutting agenda doesn't have the same real-world political attraction that it used to because most people aren't paying taxes, and of course, inflation bracket creep went away as a result of the 1981 reforms. So in terms of the tax piece of the Kemp agenda, we don't have the same practical political traction that we used to. Tax reform doesn't have the same personal feel. It's more of an economic growth argument. So I was wondering what you thought in terms of how we can proceed politically with the Kemp agenda, given the real world changes we've had since.
Well, look, I think you've got to sell tax reform on the basis that you are gonna hurt the crony capitalists as well as lower the rates, right? And you got to that will convince people that the Republicans are on your side. So that's part of it. I think another thing that I didn't mention before is infrastructure. I mean, the Republicans can't, did they finally pass the highway bill? If you can't pass a highway bill, you can't do nothing, right? This country's infrastructure has fallen down. Anybody who's ever been to China, I'll never forget. This is one of my favorite stories. I won't go through the whole thing, but suffice it to say, I was in Tibet. I was in the wilds of Tibet. I was near the base camp of Mount Everest, out in the wilds of the wilderness. My cell phone rings. It's Fred Barnes calling me from Washington, clear as a bell. Now, you can't get cell coverage by the Lincoln Memorial in this country. The infrastructure. We rode the train down from New York yesterday, and I thought I was going to break my neck walking from one car to another. Right? You go on a bullet train in Japan or China, and it speeds along at 375 miles an hour. I mean, this country needs investment, and Republicans hate the word investment, or unless it's private. There is a need for public investment, and it can be public-private investment. You gotta do things that will convince average people that their lives will be better as a result of their action.
Explain that to the environmental movement. It doesn't want you to build anything. We wouldn't have the interstate highway system if the environmental movement had been around in the 50s. Of course we wouldn't. They'd have blocked all of it. Unless you want to spend a lot of money on bike paths, then you're just
but blaming
not gonna get this through.
I'm not blaming Democrats.
I'm blaming the environmental movement. No, I'm not. Blaming the environmental movement.
Same thing.
Well, close.
Let me ask one question, then we're going to come back over here. I know we need to wrap up our time, but one of the things that sometimes I think Jack Kemp was criticized for was he didn't care that much about deficits. People say he doesn't care about that because we can grow our way out of it. Would he care about it today, considering where we are, and how does that affect the current political environment that we're in?
Paul Ryan says that is the difference, that Kemp didn't care about deficits, and I think he was right at the time, but Paul Ryan says this is a different time now, and the deficits are so big and the debt is so big that it is something that does have a deleterious effect on the economy and growth, that you need to do something. You have to take that into account. But Kemp, when he had to choose between the deficit going up and tax rate cuts that would spur economic growth and jobs and income, and savings, if you had to choose, for him it was an easy choice. Forget about the deficit, we're going with the tax cuts because we want growth. Growth was his favorite word. Good word.
All right, we'll come back here. Final question.
Vicki Dutcher, the Heritage Foundation. What is with the aversion that Congress, the legislative branch, has against putting together legislation? You just were talking a little bit ago about McConnell says we're going to wait for the White House to put it together when we get a new president. I mean, they don't. That's not what their job is. So why do these guys want to constantly give up their job? And in response to what you just said, Mort, was if the government is going to be in charge of that new high-speed rail, I mean, really? We just gave them health care.
You need the federal highway system was built by government. I mean, government's got some things to do. I think you do public-private partnerships. You have toll roads, right? You get a private contractor to do it. Now, I know that you need to eliminate Davis-Bacon, which is a requires that union wages be paid on every federal contracted project. That ought to be gotten rid of, and I know it's a tough task because the labor unions, want it, and the Democrats will back up the labor unions, and it's not as efficiently done. But we need the investment, and I would say, it's going to be built by private contractors anyway. The government doesn't have the bulldozers to actually do the job, and I'm not saying that it's easy to fix Amtrak up and down the East Coast. It's a big, expensive, difficult job, but nonetheless, we need it. So, as to why Congress doesn't get anything done, Fred is here. He watches the Congress much more closely than I do. I now live in Bainbridge Island, Washington.
I watch it a little. My son works for Kevin McCarthy, and I don't hear much from him. People, I think, figure, well, he's giving me secret information. He stonewalls. But look, we do need some to build some things. But this rapid rail system, I mean, between the one that really gets me is the one that they want to build for zillions of dollars between Orlando and Tampa, which is what, 70 or 80 miles, something like that. Okay, so you get on a train in Orlando and you go to Tampa. You still have to rent a car or something then anyway. I mean, nobody's going to ride on it. Then you have the one in California that Jerry Brown and Obama keep insisting on that's out in the wilderness of central California now where they're building it at first. And this is hundreds of billions of dollars, a waste of money, when they could do something that you've suggested, Mort, where the traffic is, where people will ride trains, and there are very few corridors, but the one between Washington and Boston is one. They could improve that. It would take a lot of money, but it would affect ridership favorably. But nobody's going to ride these crazy things that Obama's proposing. They're already wasting billions of dollars on them, and even if they finish them, nobody's going to ride.
And we need airports, and we need bridges, and we need waterways, and we need sewer lines and stuff like that. It's all falling apart. Anyway.
On an optimistic note, since we're talking about Jack Kemp, I do want to encourage you, both authors have agreed to stay here and sign autographed copies if you would like to get those. So you can get a book right outside, come in, they're going to stay here, and they'll be happy to autograph them for you. Please join me in thanking Fred Barnes, Morton Kondracke. And thank you all for being here as well. Again, the books are outside, and we'll stay here for a few minutes if you'd like to come in and get an autographed copy. Thank you.